And so we're going to continue today going through the book of Ecclesiastes. How life's pointlessness points to Christ has been the heading or the title of the series, rather. And so we've been in it for a couple weeks, and what we've been seeing is that really the main point of the book is that everything under the sun is ultimately frustrating. This is not necessarily the book that you usually go to when you're trying to attract people in, at least not at first glance. It's actually a great book toward that end because everybody knows that life is frustrating. What Ecclesiastes shows us is that life is a vapor with no substance, and that life under the sun is, even as our cool little graphic has, it's a mist. A mist. It's like something that you try to grab, it's there, and you can sort of feel it, but as soon as you try to grab it, you find that there's nothing there. Your hand is empty. And throughout this book, God is calling us to follow the frustrations of the sin-cursed world that we live in, to follow those frustrations to his Son who bore the curse for us. And then when our hearts are fixed upon Christ who is above the sun, we can begin to come back beneath the sun and find appropriate and real joy even within the frustrations of our lives. What this book is going to do is it's going to do a type of back and forth where it's going to tear everything apart under the sun. And it's going to grab a hold at times of things that we really like and that we've really placed a lot of hope in, and it's going to say, nah, that's empty. It's a mist. But it doesn't do that simply to tear us down, but it does that so that God, by his Spirit, might build something stronger in its place, that we might be able to begin to see some substance within the mist. So if you have a Bible or Bible app, I'll invite you to turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 2. If you don't have either one of those, you can feel free to use a black hardcover Bible that is somewhere around you, on a seat around you, underneath a seat. As you turn now, I want to start with just asking this question. Why are Americans so unhappy? Why are Americans so unhappy? And that's not a question that I'm making up on my own. It's a question that really pervades a lot of academic research of our day. On any given day of the week, you could grab your phone, pull up NBC News, pull up CBS News, maybe drive up the road, turn on NPR, and it is not at all uncommon to go to one of those sources and to find some individual who is at least claiming to be an expert at some way and being able to decipher this question, and they are attempting to figure out why Americans are so depressed. Again and again and again, that's what the academic minds of the day are trying to determine, because it is a perplexing reality to the secular and the academic mind that one of the wealthiest and most privileged people on the planet are routinely found to be far less content than people who have a fraction of the stuff that we do. We have more pleasure at our fingertips than anybody in the world presently, and more opportunity than much of human history has ever had, and yet we are, across the board, generally as Americans, an unhappy people. Maybe this describes you today. Maybe you feel like just an unhappy person. The question there is why? Why is that the case? Well, Solomon has an answer for us, and it's simply this, that pleasure can't fulfill life under the sun. So we're going to read Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. If you're willing and able, I want to invite you to stand for the reading of God's word. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, starting with verse 1, it says this. This is Solomon speaking by the inspiration of the Spirit of God, and he says, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after the wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun. This is the word of the Lord for us today. You guys can be seated. The main point of the sermon is this is what Solomon finds, is that pleasure can't fulfill life under the sun. Pleasure can't fulfill life under the sun. It's going to be 4 points that we're going to go through as we go through this text. If you have one of the Rhythm of Worship guides, if you're in Slack, you have it digitally, or if you picked up one of the paper copies, these 4 points are in there as well. And the first point is going to be to pay attention to wisdom's test. The second point is going to be to see life's timeless offerings. The third point, to examine the emptiness. And the fourth point, to look above the sun for joy. So let's jump in. First point is pay attention to wisdom's test. And for that, we're just looking right at verse 1. It says this, I said in my heart, Solomon says, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. So what we see there is Solomon, and if you haven't been with us, this book is written by a guy named Solomon. He was a king of Israel. He was a son of King David. And he was known as one of the really the wisest men in the world. He asked God. God told him he could have anything he wanted. He asked him for wisdom. And so he wrote a lot of the books of the Bible that we would call the wisdom literature. He wrote the book of Proverbs. He wrote Ecclesiastes as well as a book called the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon. And so he is known for that wisdom. And what he does here is he sets to test out pleasure and to test out self-indulgence. That's what he says right in the first verse. He says, I'm going to test these things out. And he knows testing even from experience. If we were to turn to 1 Kings chapter 10, that gives a little bit of a running narrative on Solomon's life. And there was a point where the queen of Sheba, she had heard of Solomon's greatness. A lot of the greatness that he shows in this passage. He is magnificently rich. We learned last week he had about 5 PhDs, probably more. He's the wisest man on the earth. She had heard of his greatness. And the text in 1 Kings 10 says that she wants to come to test him. And what that means is she wants to sit with him. She wants to talk with him and listen. She wants to see with her eyes if Solomon is all that people say that he is. And her answer when she walks away is, yeah, he's pretty cool. What most people say is she actually says that people don't do him a justice, and they talk him up a lot. But even what they say doesn't match the reality. So the point is that Solomon has experienced that type of testing, and now he's on the other side of the table. He's putting pleasure and self-indulgence on the other side of the chair. He's putting the light hanging above straight into its face. He's going to engage with pleasure. He's going to taste its fruits, and he's going to determine if it is all that people say it is. Solomon knows what testing is, and he's setting out to apply that testing to pleasure itself to see if it can bring substance in the midst. Another important point is that Solomon is actually testing in wisdom, not in recklessness. That's important because this text is not Solomon's trip to Vegas with his buddies. This is not a drunken, self-indulgent bender, but this is a deliberate attempt to test pleasure and find its value under the sun. How do we know this? Because Solomon is careful to tell us as much. In verse 3 and in verse 9, he's careful to say, my wisdom has not left me. I am not, he's been saying a lot of things about how life is empty, but what this is not is him just sort of giving in and saying, I'm just going to run off and indulge everything possible. But no, he's still on the quest. Even with his wisdom, he is still trying to figure out where is there substance within the mist. And what Solomon finds, as he often shares with us in Ecclesiastes, is that pleasure fails the test. He already tells us that, verse 1. In some ways, the whole section here, it could kind of stop in a sense, and we would understand what Solomon's point is by itself just at verse 1. He says, I set out to test pleasure. I told my heart, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself. And he says, but behold, this was also vanity. It was hevel, that Hebrew word that Solomon uses over and over again. It was the mist. It was empty. It was formless. He says pleasure is a mist. It's a vapor that brings nothing of real meaning or value under the sun. And in many ways, the whole book of Ecclesiastes, and this passage in particular, is asking that age-old question, which is that, is there anything on earth that can truly satisfy the human heart? And Solomon, throughout Ecclesiastes, is systematically going from one part of life to another and just checking the boxes as failed, 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 failed. And here he checks pleasure off the list. Because Solomon finds that old paradox of pleasure seeking, which is the more you hunt for pleasure, the less you find it. Solomon tells us right away that pleasure can't fulfill life under the sun. So there's the answer. We should just go home. Not really. Not yet. Because Solomon is going to go into detail now about how he tested pleasure and how he found that pleasure can't fulfill life under the sun. And we want to follow him there as he explains. So the second point is this, is to see life's timeless offerings. And that's basically all of verse 2 to verse 10. What we see there is that Solomon is going to test 9 key areas of pleasure under the sun. These are places that humanity has consistently sought to find pleasure, fulfillment, or meaning under the sun. And there's nothing new under the sun, and so Solomon's exploits will show us that. Because the 9 areas that he tests that we can see in the text are this. Number 1, laughter, that we see in verse 2. Alcohol, we see in verse 3. Art, in verse 4. Nature, in verses 5 and 6. Money and possessions, in verses 7 and 8. Music, in verse 8. Sex, in verse 8. Affirmation, in verse 9. And work, in verse 11. So he's basically got the whole gamut of where we might attempt to find pleasure, to find meaning under the sun. One commentator actually describes Solomon as, quote, building a secular Garden of Eden with no forbidden fruits. And that's actually a really great way of showing how Solomon's aims fit perfectly with the aims of the culture that we live in. Like, this is a very relevant passage for us. I've already tried to make that connection in the beginning with the story about just Americans in general, but the reality is that American culture is, and has been for some time, and especially now, is attempting to build a type of secular Garden of Eden with no forbidden fruits. The creed of our day and our culture is come. It is the same thing that Solomon says, come now, enjoy yourself. Enjoy yourself. Enjoy yourself. That's what all the advertising is after. That's what everything that we live and breathe in all of the time. That's what the television is always doing. That's what the email ads are always doing. Everything. Come and enjoy yourself. In reality, we are drunk as Americans on pleasure seeking. It is everywhere, and it is fully embraced. We take in massive amounts of entertainment. We live for acquiring wealth through our careers. We seek every form of sexual gratification imaginable, and some of those that we have never even imagined before. Solomon is, in some ways, your average American living in 2023. He just has a bit more resources than most of us do. And if we're really honest, like really, really, really honest, and we really look at some of the stuff Solomon says here, many of us would probably find that Solomon's life here sounds pretty good. Sounds all right. If just honest. A big house, lots of money. It's engaged, just whatever pleasure sort of comes. I mean, he says in the verse, I kept no pleasure from my heart. Like, tell me that doesn't sound good to you at first glance. Tell me there's not something within you that says, I would like that. I can see that pull within myself, and I bet if you're honest, you can see that pull within yourself in some way as well. When we look at Solomon's life here, here's where the point gets a little sharper, because his life is really marked by self-centered pleasure in all of its forms. And that's just what sounds pretty good to me. It can sound pretty good to you too. Living for yourself, indulging your every desire. And notice in the text, he does it all for himself. In verses 4 and 8, he says many times that he didn't just do these things, but he did them for himself. Verse 4, he says, I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks. I made myself pools from which to water the forest. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. And verse 8, I gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. Verse 10, he says, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept from my heart no pleasure. He's an American with an unbelievable amount of resources to actually live out what many in our culture are living out and what the pull of our hearts just wants to live out a lot of times. Solomon is living the American way. He's living our way. Because living to even feed our desires, so it doesn't have to be a big thing, but just living to feed our desires and feeling that pull is really just a normal week for many of us. Even if it's not some of the ways that he's talking about, but just that desire to live for your own pleasure, for your own comfort, for your own satisfaction. It might not be as big as these things, like I mentioned, but our attempts, we do have attempts to fill our lives with endless entertainment through things like football or video games, or endless amounts of sexual intimacy through pornography or even just multiple partners, endless achievements through career advancements, money stacking. At the end of the day, it all begins to look much the same. And again, I just know these things are true for me. God help me. But is it true for you too? That's the first question that you have to press into. Is it true for you? Do you feel that pull towards these things? Do you spend much of your life, much of the individual moments of your life, just seeking your own pleasure? Seeking what feels good in the moment that you're in. And Solomon has helpful words for us because he's not here just to guilt trip us about that. And that's not my aim either. But he's here to convince us that the life of pleasure seeking is vanity. It is meaningless. It is a mist. Because what happens is that Solomon finds a type of temporary happiness in the text we can see, but no lasting satisfaction. And that's important to note because the text gives a type of signal that Solomon found some happiness in the pursuit of this pleasure. We can see that in verse 10, where he says, "For my heart found pleasure in all of my toil." Like that's his work, and there's a sense in which that work and doing that hard work that he does here gives some sense of happiness, some sense of accomplishment. And if he's found that some level of happiness or even joy in his work, it can be safely assumed that much of what he pursued had very real moments of feeling good and feeling right. And that's part of what makes the pleasure seeking so attractive, is because for a moment it does feel good. When we get the thing that we want, it does feel good because it feels good to us in our flesh to indulge our pleasures. That's why the creed that is a creed of our day and can be the cry of our own hearts is, if it's wrong, why does it feel so right? You ever thought that before? If it's actually wrong, why does it feel so right? Why does it feel so natural? Why does it feel so good? And so Solomon experiences some level of happiness in that pleasure seeking, some level of good feeling, as we can too, but he finds that it's all vanity. It's all ultimately a mist. Because the mist offers highs in life that are void of substance. Solomon discovers that what many of us will discover, which is that there are ways to remain distracted with pleasure for long periods of time. It's possible to live for the next thrill, the next high, the next adventure, but the problem is that eventually the thrill will run dry. And so the search for the next thrill, for the next pleasure in the mist, continues to go on. I have a kind of a long quote from one guy who comments on the passage, but I want to read it, and I want you to see if maybe at any point in your life, or maybe even today, this sort of thing sounds familiar to you. He says this: foraging for pleasures, we rebel as teenagers or in our midlife crisis. On our walls, we put up posters or take them down. We take our jobs and leave them. We drink our booze or give it up. We take our medicine or quit it. We undress with strangers or refuse to do so. We marry our spouses or leave them. We have our kids or estrange them. We dye our hair or leave it natural. We change our clothes or garage sale them. We save our money or spend it all. And all of it is hoping that there will be some gas station in life, a figurative or literal lottery ticket with a winning number that waits somewhere for us to find it. And that's what this life can look like, chasing our own desires, chasing the pleasure. Because it's a mist. You can't grab it. It just gets away. There's no substance and there's no end in living for our own pleasures. It's a treadmill that we'll never be able to get off of. That same commentator continues. He has another quote that I want to read because I just think they're really helpful. He says this: so in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, Solomon basically tells us that life under the sun always has 9 basic amusements available for us on its closet shelves. Therefore, our options for a high under the sun always abound. But take note, the same old closet has offered these same 9 games to every generation under the sun. These games are fun. They are very old, tattered, and badly worn with use. Oh, and they're the only games in town. So the point here is not to take that list of 9 things that I said and say that all of those things are evil. It's not the point. I need you to hear that, because that's not the point. The point is not that all of those 9 things are evil. In fact, all of those things, when used rightly, could actually be sources of joy under the sun when our affections and our hearts are in the right place. The point is that a life built on them, on any of them, on all of them, a life built on just chasing our pleasures will crumble and will lead to heartbreak and despair because they're a mist. They can't handle the weight of our affections being placed on them. Pleasure can't fulfill life under the sun because the pleasures by themselves are empty of meaning and substance. So how do we know that? Let's dive a bit deeper into the third point there, which is examine the emptiness. So the reason really behind the book, or underneath the whole book of Ecclesiastes, that we have to always keep before us is that death drains everything under the sun for Solomon. That's the point. Solomon is seeking to address how to find purpose in the life under the sun, and that phrase, under the sun, refers to life in the cursed world. Solomon is writing while living in a post-Edenic exile. It's a big word. What it simply means is he's writing while he's living outside of the garden of God because of the sin of our first parents. And the sin of Adam and Eve and our own sin has led, we looked at last week in Genesis chapter 3, it has led to God's cursing of this world. And the frustrations of life are the result of this curse, and the fruit of the curse is ultimately death. And so for Solomon, death drains everything under the sun because it is the very thing that just renders it all meaningless. If we were to look at 4 of those 9 sources of pleasure, 4 that I think can be particular temptations for us, let's do that briefly. The first one that I would say would be alcohol. Here's the thing. Alcohol can be a good source of joy when used appropriately. And the scriptures declare that wine makes a cheerful heart. But alcohol can also be a terribly destructive force in the lives of others. And when a person allows it to grip their hearts, it can destroy marriages and even destroy their life. But here's the point. When it comes to alcohol, the tragedy of the mist is that the good uses and the bad uses both have the same end, and that's death. The person who uses it rightly will end up in the ground beside the person who let it take their life. And that's the mist that Solomon is so trying to lay before us. We talk about money. That was another one of Solomon's sources of pleasures. And money can be a good source of joy when it's earned through hard work and when it's used for good, for yourself, for your family, for those around you. Money can also be a terribly destructive force when a person allows the love of it to grip their hearts and move them into all manners of unethical behavior. But again, when it comes to money, the tragedy of the mist is that the good users and the bad users end up in the ground together. We talk about sex. Sex can be a great and a beautiful source of joy when it's expressed in a healthy way, in the covenantal context of marriage between one man and one woman. It can also be terribly destructive when sexual perversity grips the heart and leads a person into all types of debauchery. And again, when it comes to sex, the tragedy of the mist is that those who use it rightly find appropriate joy in it, and those that use it wrongly will lie in the grave beside each other. The fourth one is affirmation. Just affirmation, meaning having people affirm you, say good things. That can be a great and a beautiful thing. When parents affirm their unconditional love for their children, it as an example, but it serves to form a stable and secure person as they grow. We should do that, parents. It's very important to the development of our kids. Affirmation can be good and beautiful in those ways. It can also be bad when a person desires it so much, they have a fear of man, they begin to compromise morals in order to get that affirmation. But again, when it comes to affirmation, the tragedy of the mist is that those who use it appropriately and those who don't will lie in the grave beside each other. And so for Solomon, for all of this pleasure, for all of the joys, for all of the thrills, for all of the roller coaster ride that he goes on, for all the ways that pleasure feels good in the moment, the reason that he rightly says it is vanity, it is a mist, is because it can't fix the curse. And so I can build my big old house, but I can't take it with me. I'm going to go into the ground one day. Somebody else is going to take it over. They're going to destroy it, or it's going to fall to ruins. And every one of those things, the point is that Solomon, by the grace of God, just sees through it. And he does it for us. He says, no amount of alcohol, no amount of money, no amount of sex, no amount of affirmation, no amount of any of the pleasures that we've talked about is going to keep you or me out of the grave. It's coming for us. Death drains everything under the sun. Pleasure can't fulfill life under the sun. That is the weight of the book of Ecclesiastes, is living in light of the curse. And he just recognizes that death is lurking. And because of that, everything is a mist. It's going away. It's heavy. The reason this book is so helpful, the reason this passage is so helpful, is because it's true. It's real. It's helpful. Because we have to think about that. And this book helps us. What is the measure of my life in light of the fact that I am going to die at the end? That everybody that I love is most likely going to die as well. So how do I even make sense of the life that I'm living? Solomon's answer for us, our final point, the answer that he is going to say in some explicit ways throughout the book, and he's going to kind of hide in there and it pokes through at times, is that we have to learn to look above the sun for joy. Because everything under the sun is cursed, and everything under the sun is ultimately subject to the final end of the curse, which is death. And so it's all hevel, it's all a mist, it's all vanity. So he says we have to look above the sun for joy. Years ago, I was with a different ministry, and we had kind of this catchphrase, wouldn't be the right word. It was just sort of a phrase that we would say a lot. And it said this: only God can bear the weight of our worship. That's what I would say, is only God can bear the weight of our worship. And that's just a phrase that echoes throughout this book. Because Ecclesiastes teaches us that only Christ can bear the weight of our worship. Any pleasure that we build our lives around, that we set our affections on, will crumble beneath the weight of worship of the human heart. Because it's not built for that. And it's affected by the curse, so it can't even withstand that or sustain that. It's a vanity and it's a mist that will be swallowed up. But Christ can bear the weight of our worship under the the sun. Because he has come under the sun, died beneath the curse, and then raised in victory again over it. He is the answer to the problem of the whole book of Ecclesiastes. He is the thing that gives substance in the midst because he's the only one that takes death away. Everything else in our lives is lived against that shadow. All of our pleasure seeking is lived against that shadow. But the one who has victory over death is the one that we can then look to say there is hope, there is meaning, there is life, because there's one who's gotten victory over death, and he's promised that if I believe in him, if I cling to him, if I follow him, then death will not be the end for me either. Through his life, he lived for sinners like us. In his death, he died for the forgiveness of sinners like us. And in his resurrection over death and hell, he himself becomes the substance in the midst. And when we look above the sun to where Christ is, and we look to him in repentance and faith, then we can come back below the sun and begin to find appropriate joy in legitimate pleasures of this life, even within the frustrations that exist with them. And we can know that because of the things I've already mentioned, Jesus' work for his people, and also that Jesus is the greater Solomon who brings substance to the midst. Because Solomon says that seeking pleasure in alcohol is vanity. Jesus agrees, but he goes further than Solomon ever could. In John chapter 6, he says, "Do not work for the food that perishes, but whoever comes to me shall never hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." Jesus satisfies our deepest thirst under the sun, and we can then come find appropriate joy in food and drink and all types of things under the sun once our hearts are satisfied in him. Jesus is the greater Solomon who brings substance to the midst, because Solomon says that seeking pleasure in money is vanity, and Jesus agrees, but goes further. In Isaiah chapter 55, as it's speaking of the reality of the good news of Jesus, the text says, "Come, everyone who thirsts, and he who has no money, come and buy and eat. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for which that does not satisfy? But listen diligently to me and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in rich food." The promise of Isaiah is that Christ would come, and he would offer the food that satisfies to those who have no money. Jesus offers grace that money can't buy, and in fact, the requirement for this grace is to be poor and destitute. And anybody and everybody who sees their poverty under the sun is invited to come to Christ for grace and life and glory that can't be bought but is freely given. Jesus offers grace under the sun that our money can't buy, and then we can come back under the sun and find appropriate joy in the use of our money within the midst. Jesus is the greater Solomon. Solomon says that seeking pleasure in sex is vanity. Jesus agrees, but he goes further. In John chapter 4, he talks to a woman who has had 5 husbands and is currently shacking up with a new guy. And he looks at her and he offers her substance within the midst when he says, "I am the Christ and I have living water to satisfy you." He's not talking about the water. He's talking about that thing that she's chasing. That thing that's taken her through 5 marriages. That thing that's got her at least on a 6th guy, probably more. But he looks at her, he knows everything about her, and he offers to her and to us an eternal covenant love that satisfies in the midst. A love that never leaves or forsakes. A love that holds firm through the frustrations of life and even can overcome the sin that we commit. When we come to Christ and our hearts are settled in his covenant love, then we can come back and find appropriate joy in the acts of covenant marriage under the sun. Jesus is the greater Solomon. Solomon says that pleasure through affirmation is vanity. Jesus agrees, But again, he goes further. In John chapter 2, it says that Jesus took neither praise nor criticism to heart because he knew what was in the heart of man, which is kind of a backhanded indictment on us in its own right. It's like, I don't care what y'all say. Y'all are crazy. Literally crazy. But he doesn't take it to heart. He doesn't care about the affirmations of the people of his day because he knows they'll turn their back. He doesn't care about the criticisms because he knows they're selfish and fickle. And instead of living for those types of affirmations, Jesus crowns his people with honor and praise from God. His people are crowned in him by being united to him in faith and receiving the honor that he receives from his Father. His people will be crowned by him when they stand before him on the last day. And one day, we will all cast our crowns back at his feet as trophies of his grace. And so we need not fear people or live as slaves of their approval when we have the greatest affirmation we could ever need in Christ. Accepted, forgiven, adopted, loved, and secure forever. Jesus crowns his people with his honor. And with our hearts settled there, we can come and find appropriate joys in the right affirmations and not be crushed by the criticisms under the sun. Pleasure can't fulfill life under the sun. So we look above the sun to Jesus. We place our hope on him. And we come back and learn to have appropriate joy within the appropriate pleasures that exist even within the frustrations of the mist. Let me pray for us.